But there is a path that is the path of neither holding into this problematic system at all costs, even if it comes at your own sacrifice, or we're just going to be in total chaos and everything's just going to go to hell.
Gonna blow up.
But yeah, but to actually know, like, we can actually adapt, we can actually mature, we can actually embody something that is fundamentally right and aligned.
Hey friends, Irene Lyon here. Welcome to this long form interview with my good friend, a peer and really one of my mentors, Chris Dierkes. I've known Chris for well over 6 years now. And we did a chat back in 2017 titled Meditation and Mindfulness 101. And I felt like it was time to do a round 2 and get him back to talk about some more specifics in and around spirit, so spiritual practice, the soul, what the soul is. I mean, how many times do we hear, oh, that person is a lost soul, etc. And in this work of healing trauma and neuroplasticity and nervous system health, I am starting to bring more of my attention and focus to what is beyond the physical. Now, the physical is very important, and Chris and I talk about this. We need to work with the physical nervous system, the trauma that's at the cellular level, and then there's this other element which we call the soul. So we get into what that actually is. We get into what spirit is, and it's not something that is what some people might think of as religion. We get into that. We get into the definition of religion. He at one point was a priest, and he left that profession, if you will, to still work with people in the spirit soul way, but more outside of the church. So we get into some fun stories. He used to work and provide counsel at a maximum security prison in Detroit. Lots of stories. So we really go kind of full circle. We also get into religious trauma, where that comes from, how fundamentalism pops into our world and the dangers of that, of course. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Chris Dierkes. And leave a comment or a note somewhere near this video or audio. Take very good care. Enjoy. I wanted to chat to you today. It's work we've worked on personally, individually, and of course, I've been super grateful for what we've learned, what I've learned learning from you. We're going to dive into the topics of soul, spirit, trauma, not having, a traumatic experience doing this work. I have notes, everyone, that Chris sent me about topics. So we'll get through these. I might, just refresh my memory every now and again. But what I wanted to ask you first, and right before we got on to record, I said, hey, I want to first get you to define what we would say is religion. And the reason why is my assumption, and this is a generalization, is when people hear the word spirit, they think Holy Spirit. When they think soul or the word, it's kind of this elusive, what does that mean? Is that a God? Is that an orb? Is that an aura? Is that a pixie floating around? And I think I want to kind of just make those, define a few things so that people understand your lingo, what this is. This isn't about religion necessarily. So maybe just start with that. Like, how would you answer someone that says, oh, I don't want to work with soul and spirit because I'm not religious?
Right. Yeah, I think let's maybe start with soul and spirit, because that's always, I think, a good place to start. So, so spirit, as I would use the lingo, the language there, refers to what I would consider to be a universal aspect.
Okay.
So the same for all of us. Spiritual language tends to be language of things like oneness or unity, non-separation, the universal. So to me, spirit speaks to that sense of what is universal or what is the same for all of us.
Would that be like some people often say we're one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Speaks to oneness and unity for sure.
Perfect.
And I think that's the hallmark of individuals who touch into that aspect of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that I think is a genuine thing that goes around, and that's not, we can find versions of that from around the world and from various times throughout history. Mm-hmm. Soul, I would say, is more the unique expression of that oneness refracted through or individualized through a person.
Okay.
So soul is like, maybe as an example, sometimes we use is like, there's one sun, mm-hmm. and there's one light, mm-hmm. expressed from the sun, mm-hmm. but it comes through distinct rays.
Perfect. Yeah.
So the soul to me is more the nature of the rays, mm-hmm. and spirit is more the nature of the light or the sun, the source, I guess.
The source. Got it.
Metaphor.
That's a great example.
Yeah. And I think both are important. So sometimes if, like in my example, the reason that I have an emphasis on soul work, mm-hmm. is because my 20s were spent so heavily focused on spiritual enlightenment and spiritual practice that kind of the source and the sun and the light was so much the focus that I lost contact with my own ray, if you like, or my own embodiment or expression. Mm-hmm. And that led to some problems, which is how I ended up seeing you, among other things.
Do you mind and I know we're going to get into this, but give us an example, like what was for you the problem of having such a direction on that spirit, but neglecting the soul element?
That I lost a sense of my own guidance or direction, or a sense of my own purpose, mm-hmm. and alignment. Because if it's all just kind of the universal, there was a tendency to get kind of lost in the cosmic soup, I guess, or to not have a sense of, okay, where's my place connected to and part of, certainly not separate from, but in coordination with this larger whole. And that would show up like things like disconnection or challenge to understand my emotional life, because I was supposed to just be kind of serene and all loving and compassionate and one, and not have anger or not have fear, or these were all things kind of lower, obviously, or as well as, you know, trauma stuff. Or the thing about the spiritual aspect of ourselves is it's already perfect. It never gets wounded. It's never fractured.
Got it.
So if you hang out there all the time, there can be a seductive tendency to think like, oh, I don't have to worry about all that lower stuff.
The shall I say, the spirit will just take care of me no matter what I do.
Right.
That actually, true story. I know you know my husband, Seth. And he's not like this now, everyone. But way before I met him, he went through his own process of healing his own trauma, like all of us, or at least we have. And there was a point of like 2 years where he didn't brush his teeth. And he did that not because he was necessarily stupid. You know, I didn't marry an idiot, but he really felt that if I am connected and meditating and eating vegan and all this, that my teeth will just be taken care of by the God, the spirit. And oh, is that a mistake?
Right.
You know,
we're still human. We're still in this incarnation.
Exactly. And he's, you know, sure, his teeth had a beating, and of course now he sees a dentist and takes care of them. But it was also with his physical health. He didn't exercise, you know, and when I met him, he was a mess. And I'm allowed to talk about him. He's given me permission to say these things. But it was what you were saying there. so focused on something else, taking care of him, that he neglected the physical care that we really all do need to have. And I want to get back to the definition of soul, spirit, and the two, but I did a bio intro for you before we got on, but can you give your Cole's Notes, Cliff Notes version of your studies, like in your 20s you mentioned, and how you entered and also how you exited, if there's such thing as an exit or a shift in direction?
Yeah. So I was raised really very traditionally Roman Catholic.
Yep.
So I was an altar boy at a young age, and did all that. And I actually loved all that.
Yeah.
I loved a lot of it, actually. I went to religious school, aspects of that, not so. I had the classic, I actually had nuns teach me, who still wore habits sometimes. Yep. And they were totally your classic on both sides of the stereotype. Like, they were the ones who were like the sweetest angels, who would be the most loving beings, who just all the kids would run up and they'd hug them. And it was the greatest thing in the world. Yeah. To the meanest, gnarly, like ice. Yeah, and I had both. I got a taste of both. So, when I was very young, I had a strong sense of what I guess I would say now is a connection to the spirit world. Mm-hmm. So, it was all interpreted through the lens of my religious upbringing. Mm-hmm. So, it was like Mary and angels and saints and Jesus and halos and rosaries and again, I actually love all that stuff. Yeah. I think there's a lot of beauty in that. Yep. So, when I was growing up, I kind of would often look to the priests and think, well, maybe in this system, within this parameters, if you're feeling a connection like that, that's where you go. Right. Now, if I would have been a girl, there would have been a whole other thing, which is like, I can't be a priest. And then I would have had that whole struggle. Yeah. My version of that was like, but I also kind of like girls. I think I want to get married at some point. So that became something. Yeah. So when I was 20, when I finished my undergraduate degree, I joined a religious order. Mm-hmm. So that meant that I had vows. Mm-hmm. And that I was early on, but still in the training to become eventually a priest. Mm-hmm. in the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church. And I was in a group called the Jesuits. Mm-hmm. The current Pope is a Jesuit. Mm-hmm. He's the first one, and they're known to be a bit radical in various ways, and I appreciated it because. There was a strong emphasis there of like teaching, and there were doctors and there were lawyers, and I liked that sense of like mission and brotherhood. And what was radical about? How are they radical? Curious there. There would definitely be some were quite radical in terms of like political, social justice type things, or because they're not part of the like official, other than the current Pope is one, so that throws it off a little bit, but generally they're not part of the official like normal hierarchy. Okay. They're kind of a little bit of free agents. Mm. So, still within the system, but they have a degree of autonomy. Mm. And so they would tend to get things like some of the toughest assignments, or they'd be in, challenging neighborhoods or really interesting on the ground type stuff. Mm-hmm. So when I was 21 and in training, they really put me through the ringer. One of my first ministries that I worked at was that I was a chaplain in the maximum security wing, the male side of a jail outside Detroit. Oh my goodness. there was a women's wing and then there was a
Sure.
men's wing.
Wow.
My partner would go to the women's wing and I would go over to the male side of the prison, the jail. And I was on the maximum security wing. So that was, I mean, I grew up in this very nice, middle class, Catholic little insulated bubble world. And that was really seeing what it's like outside the bubble.
Good. I bet you have some great stories from that time.
Yeah. And especially to see, like in, I guess we'd say biblical terms, the belly of the beast, right? Like the system that I would go into, and I had a little photo of me and I'd have to show it up and everything was like cameras.
Right.
Now the kind of stuff
security, so.
Yeah, exactly. And there was electronic doors and each door would open. It was very kind of terrifying. And then I'd walk in and then the door would slam shut and then the next one wouldn't open up. And they had all these mechanisms in case there were breakouts or riots or whatever. And I had to sign my life away. I remember it was like, when I promised to do it, it was like, if there's it was like all these like worst case catastrophic scenarios. It was like, if there's a riot, we'll try not to kill you, but we're just going to be like shooting pretty much willy-nilly into the crowd. And if you take one, you're signing up to be collateral damage, and we don't take hostages, and we don't. It was like, okay.
Oh my God.
This is quite a thing. Now my actual experience was that all the inmates that I ever hung out with were actually just really, kind human beings.
Yeah.
Most of whom who would, were pretty open about the situations they had found themselves in and stuff they had done. So now I got kind of a selected population because they reached out to have someone talk to them.
They wanted that counsel.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. So that was one of your assignments.
That was that. I spent 4 years of 20 to 24, and it was really life-changing and really, really powerful, but I wasn't meant to do it for life. I left that and then switched denominations, which is another branch within Christianity, essentially, and became Anglican in Canadian terms, or Episcopalian for the Americans.
Yeah.
Which is kind of has a lot of the Catholic ritual and liturgy and so on, but also is more like women can be priests and priests can get married, and there's more kind of generally liberal social kind of political views that tend to accord more with my beliefs about the world. And so I finished my studies and I was ordained when I was 30. So that's a decade ago now. And spent 3 years in full-time ordained ministry. So doing all the things, baptisms and weddings and funerals and preaching and sitting through lots and lots of meetings, raising money, all that kind of stuff. But also seeing within all of that, every so often somebody would come in to see me for counsel, and that was the part I actually loved the most. And at a certain point I realized, well, if that's the thing that I love the most, maybe I should just really do that.
And what year was that when you had that epiphany?
Probably 9 years ago, I guess now.
Okay.
So I was still there. I spent 3 years in that. And also while I was doing that, I had a series of very intense dreams that lasted for about a year. And those also, in a sense, kind of pointed me in the direction that my life has taken since.
Got it.
So when I finished my term, I asked for leave of permission. And that was about 7 years ago now. And I thought I'd give it a year or two just to see if I could put up a shingle and see what would happen. And that was 7 years ago.
Wow. I've never heard the term leave of permission. I've only ever heard leave of absence. So that's
right.
Is the difference just that you're asking for permission? Could they have said no?
I mean, I guess, well, nobody can force, but basically I went without kind of like saying like, I want to try to give this thing a shot. And we had just had our first, so when I announced that, my wife was pregnant with our now 6-year-old daughter. So it was a heck of a time to be like, hey, honey, do you mind if I don't take a new job? And we got about 2 years. Well, it turned out to be like 8 months worth of savings. And hey, do you mind if I try this thing out? But she was on board, so that's cool.
That's interesting. I didn't realize. I met your daughter when she was a baby.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize that transition had happened so close to that time. So we would have met right around the time we shifted.
Yeah, that I had started doing a little bit sort of friends and friends of friends, or friends of family kind of stuff. But that was we met when I had kind of gone solo pretty early into that, actually. Yeah,
that's great. So I want to talk about your work towards the end of our chat. Mm-hmm. But let's go back to this definition of spirit and soul, which I think the way you broke that down with the sun and the rays is so easy, and that's good. What else would you want to say around that? Because you had said to me in your notes, a lot of folks, they get them confused, but you said a lot of folks in the SE world, of course, I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner, for those of you that are just tuning in here for the first time, but a lot of folks in this world, so we'll call it the somatic trauma world, let's just say, because it doesn't have to be SE. It could be body, mind, psychotherapy, etc. But a lot of these people will have some spiritual background, so mindfulness, like we discussed in our previous interview.
Right.
And then also body-mind practices on the human level. But what those do is they bring forward soul pains and soul issues, which need their own set of practices.
Right.
So that's sort of like, so people are, let me just, test me here. So people are wanting a spiritual practice, whether it's meditation or mindfulness or prayer.
Yoga.
And then, but then the soul piece is, would we say neglected? Or it's just not even thought of?
It's both, yeah.
Both. So speak to that.
Well, it's important because I think for me, our kind of self, our soul, and our spirit I think we're kind of born with these, let's say. Mm-hmm. So they're always a part of us. And different traditions or different systems tend to emphasize one or another. Mm-hmm. And in what's kind of going around now, at least in the kind of circles we tend to run in, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on spiritual side. Mm-hmm. That's gotten more popular, especially in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And there's strong, healthy emphasis on body, mind, and integration and personal development and self-growth. The soul, which is kind of in the middle, if I'm drawing it along a horizontal line here, is usually the one that's not so much known about, at least in the contemporary time. Historically, it certainly has been. It's not like something that hasn't been articulated or developed. Historically, it tends to go, and has tended to go, soul work has tended to go under the language of what most people would today call probably shamanic or aboriginal or energy or indigenous type spiritualities, I suppose.
So that's where we would hear the terms such as soul retrieval,
right?
Which is thrown out
Yeah,
I don't, if someone was,
lobbed.
if you were to test me, I couldn't define what that is other than if I have wage a guess, because I've done some past life work with myself and other of our colleagues. But it feels to me like it's finding your soul.
Yeah.
Because again, correct me if I'm wrong, is there just one that we have?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's different kind of ways of how people might kind of parse that out. Yeah. And whenever we're getting into this realm, we're getting into highly symbolic, non-linear dynamics. So we always have to be really careful not to and the soul works like XYZ, like it's some math equation. It really is not that simple. But I would say, where I said earlier that for me, the spirit aspect is in an already existing state of perfection and invincibility and unwoundable quality. Souls are interesting because they can get hurt. They can get chipped and fragmented and fractured.
Thank you for saying that.
They can get healed.
Yes.
So the flip side, on the spirit side, there's a weird limitation about being perfect because it doesn't really evolve particularly. It's somewhat more static. Souls can evolve and grow. They can regress, they can progress. So there's a lot of possibility of movement in various directions. They can get in weird spin cycles, or they can get kind of lost, or in a sense, at least our connection to that aspect of ourself might get disconnected or wounded or simply forgotten, kind of covered over. And retrieval work is really about recovering those lost pieces, fragmented, and bringing them home where they belong.
Got it.
And that's definitely a classic practice within the soul domain that is distinct from, complementary ultimately, but distinct from spiritual side or even a personal growth side.
Got it.
And in terms of the religion question, because you did ask about religion.
Yeah, how does religion fit into this? And that fear that if we start doing soul work, that means that we're now bowing to a God and we'll have to profess our sins and maybe we go to hell and be like ants that we shouldn't have.
Right.
Speak to that.
Well, I think ideally, in my mind, what religion ought to be are practices and lineages and teaching systems to help pass on and transmit from generation to generation knowledge and wisdom about these aspects of ourselves and how to integrate them and how to develop them in a way that's healthy.
So the aspects of our soul, you mean?
As well as our spiritual side.
Okay.
And how to be able to link all these up to being human and having a fulfilling life and being of service and care and, cultivate values that I consider to be like life-giving. And that, I think, is what religion ought to be. The word itself, the Latin word, literally just means to link back up. So
what would be the Latin word?
Well, is like repeat or redo or whatever, again. And ligio would be the same root as like ligament.
Yep.
Right. So it's supposed to connect us back up to the divine. That's what it's supposed to do. And in its best moments, different religions, have varying degrees of this. There's so many and so diverse, but at their best moments, that's what they do. And in their worst moments.
That was my next question. How does it go so sideways that it creates, wars and divide, really?
Because I think there's a desire often to monopolize on a couple different levels. One is potentials to monopolize access.
How do you mean?
Well, for example, in my Catholic upbringing, my very traditional Catholic upbringing, like the priest is like above, not supposed to be officially, according, we could do the official theology, but in practice, everybody gets the strong sense, like the priest or whoever is supposed to be my conduit to get up the chain.
Yeah.
Right. And so that creates a lot of sense of we control the keys, whoever we are, the experts. And we can see this kind of entrainment way beyond religion now, I think, in terms of what I would consider to be like more the public religion of like science as a religion, right? Where you kind of switch over the priesthood or the magisterium to certain figures, and it's like they are above us and they control access to the ultimate knowing. And so that's a problem because it entrains helplessness.
100%. I want you to hold that thought because just what I wrote down when you said monopolize and how the religion it's done that. If I think about the world I work in, and I'll never forget, this is a picture I saw in like kinesiology 101 when I was in university first year. I still want to find it, but it was this cartoon sketch of a hole in the ground. And this guy's in the hole, like, help, I need to get up. And this, dude's looking over, just throwing him pills, and like pharmaceuticals.
Right.
It was a health and wellness class, like
for sure.
First year. And then next to it was the same guy in the hole, but the guy is coming down to a ladder, like he's giving him something to get out of the hole,
right.
Ladders and all that. And I mean, this is so common. It's classic. We all know this. I think at some soul level, some cognitive level, and it goes back to how difficult it can be to teach people that I want to help you. I'm not going to heal you. I've never considered myself a healer, although people will call me that. It's like, I want to teach you what you need to know so that you can help yourself. Because the moment that guru, I am your leader, and if you don't follow me, then you're screwed, it hasn't really worked. Except for if I have a broken leg, I want to have a healer, i.e. orthopedic surgeon. There are certain times when you need to go to that person. But by the by, I think our whole fitness, health, wellness, and even the mind, body, and spiritual practices, we've seen over the last few years, a lot of gurus get taken down.
Yeah.
And so there's like that, there's a danger in that, which I know you know.
And there's a danger, certainly. You can control access, it would be one, the spiritual access, which again, this is why I really emphasize for me, like soul and spirit to me are inborn qualities. They're part of what I consider to be like our human inheritance. So I don't think any external group or system should be able to claim the right to be able to take that. It's one thing, like we said, to assist and empower and create guidance and wisdom. I'm all for that. But it's a different thing when it becomes like, my third grade nun teacher yelling at me that I was, pushing the nails deeper into Jesus on the cross if I was a bad kid in school. Like that, no, that's a little...
Did she say that to you? Oh my goodness, poor lady.
That's extreme. That's rather extreme. But
sure. Oh wow.
But any of these kind of versions of, and along that line, like the fundamentalism aspect you were saying.
Please, yeah.
This is the only way. This is where you get another, here's the one and only way. Not only do we control access to this road, this toll, and you got to pay your toll, Right. Usually it's not that or something else, but give us your soul for all eternity or whatever. But this is the only road. And every other one that may seem like it's some path to something is actually just a pathway to damnation, parading around as if it's some goodness. And then the other guy over at the other toll booth is like, no, ours is the only one. And all the rest of you are damned. They go, no, actually, you're both damned. We're the only ones that know what's going on. Oh, get out of here.
Mess.
So
one of the best books I've ever read was Infidel. Did you ever? Ian Christian Alley?
Yeah.
Oh wow! If anyone wants a really hard and good and rich read of how fundamental religion can really brainwash, and the healing of it, because she healed, she left, she found a way out and became highly successful within government, but then also had, her life at risk because of what she was doing.
Right.
And I think she's actually in hiding. Like no one knows actually where she is at least when she wrote that book. Yeah. It's so interesting. So, and I want to put a point out just to, I've been more careful about being general about things, but what you just said about the fundamental qualities of certain religions, that this is the only way. And of course, we're saying, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are many ways and that we need to find the way that works for us. And then if I think of the work that I do, there are some things that are exact.
Right.
And I talked about this with someone yesterday, a baby crying, for example. There's no spectrum of, you see where I'm going here? There's no, oh, well, when it's like this, then don't pick them up. When they're an infant, of course, right? When they're 5, if they fall off their bike, you've got to let them cry and get the pain out, and then you scoop them up and help them. But when there's an infant there, then there should be, in my opinion, a true correct answer, which is when an infant is crying, you care for them, you go to them, you pick them up. I don't think there should be any question around that. Of course, literature will try to refute that, but I think we're actually doing well as a human species. People are learning that that really is wrong. And this is why, because we have the science now. And I feel where we get too general. We say, oh, well, that must mean that we can't be precise on one topic because we have to be general. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the application, in terms of this context, I do think there are distilled essences that we can see repeating over time and across. Not fundamentalism exists in a bunch of different religions, so that's kind of in its own weird way universal now. But I would say like the heart or the essential qualities that keep repeating over time across, to me, point to something that if wise person A over here has picked up on this idea, and very wise person or person I think is wise B over here, who never talked to each other and never lived in the same place and maybe didn't even know they existed, come up with pretty well the same idea, then I think we should take that as probably a hint that they're tuning into something quite substantial and important.
Almost like a universal law, we could say.
Yeah, something of enduring value and timeless, I think, importance, like the value of, if you really want to develop empathy, you're going to need to be able to feel the impact and imagine yourself in the shoes of another person and ask yourself, if I were on the receiving end of this behavior, would I like it?
Yeah.
That classically goes by the name of the golden rule. There's versions of that, all across do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. And there's variations on it, but it's the same basic principle. Like, think about your action. If you were on the receiving end of this, would you like it? Would you not like it? Assume that the other person is probably pretty similar to you in that regard. And if you wouldn't like it, I bet they wouldn't either. Please don't do it.
Yeah. Exactly. It's quite simple, isn't it?
It is.
And yet it just seems to get
surprisingly goes by the wayside so quickly. Yeah.
There's something about those 10 commandments, I will say. I too was raised Roman Catholic, so I didn't enjoy it the way you did. But interestingly enough, true story, just last June, maybe exactly the same time now, I was in New York teaching with my teaching partner, Elia, and my business partner was also with us. And we were out for a drink and a good time out in the city, and it was really late. It was hot. And there was this church right across from this tiny little cocktail bar we were at, Catholic. I later found out that it was one of the first ever in something, like it was a big deal and it was huge. And I'm like, come on, let's go up. And my business manager he's like, what? We're allowed? I'm like, yeah, it's a Catholic church. You can totally go. Because it was fully open, right? And it was at 1 a.m.
Wow.
And Elia has been brought up with more Jewish traditions, but he understood that. And so we went in, but it's automatic. I see the holy water. It doesn't feel right to go in without doing that. And I really enjoy it because I like water. It's a movement, right? It kind of, but we sat in there, and I do love just going into churches like that. And my business manager, was in awe. He had never been inside of a church. Oh, I was like, are you serious?
I was like, yeah, no,
it was pretty big, and he felt it. And of course it was super cool inside.
Yeah.
And it was quiet, and the candles, and so it was quite lovely. And it reminded me that the goodness in that.
Yeah.
And I hope we can get back to that and honor everyone's choices for how they choose to pray and follow.
Right.
But back
and
to
it's like a beautiful thing to be able to feel the history of all the people who've, prayed there and shed their tears and had their joy, and, all the songs that have been sung and the words that have been said. Like, you can really feel a place that has been at its best, seeded with such benevolent energy, just as sadly, if you go to a place where there's been really horrifying, terrible stuff that's occurred, you feel a sinistery, cold,
almost
evil in the air. Most places obviously are somewhere in the middle, but there are these, we can really feel the difference when there's a sense of really deep equanimity and compassion and benevolence that's been really developed amidst, undoubtedly, human beings. There's always problems, but to really feel that is awe-inspiring.
No, it was I'll have to look up what church that was and let you know. Let's get back to that idea of you said here, people will struggle and suffer for years for lack of proper context to recognize, understand, and address the soul level pieces.
Right.
So if we think of someone who this is the first time they've even heard of this, or they're listening from a different point of view, and they know, gosh, maybe this is why I can't seem to, I'm doing all these things, I'm meditating and I'm eating well and I'm doing my trauma work. And I'm starting to see, as I work with you and Janet Raftis, another one of our colleagues who does past life and psychic work, who I've also talked to, and that'll be a fun chat for you to listen to. But, I'm seeing this other piece and I'm really open to it. And so talk to that, like that person who might be in the back of their mind going, yeah, I have been struggling. This, how does someone enter into, I don't know, embracing, starting, what would you say, or how would you speak to that? And if there's a better question that I haven't been able to ask, then pose that question and speak to it.
No, that question is a great question.
Okay.
Yeah, this question of how a person starts to ever hear the voice of their soul is one of the really great mysteries. Historically, there is a long tradition that it can often come through crisis. Doesn't have to.
Through crisis.
Yeah.
Not Christ. Just wanted to be sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Can't come that way if you meet Jesus on the road, I suppose. But it's a blinding flash. But a crisis of some variety is one classic term that's usually used there as an initiation. So that could be a brush with mortality. In one's own experience, that could be a death of someone close. Can be a strange encounter with the wildness and the extreme weirdness and power of the universe.
What would that be? Because the death we get, the loss, and I think you're right. Often you hear of people's biographies, autobiographies, TED Talks, they'll say, I finally, I did see the light, whether they saw it or not, but this sickness, this death, this loss was a wake-up call. Right. And it's as if something gets implanted, or maybe it's not that it gets implanted, we wake up to what was already there.
Yeah, something dormant comes alive.
So the universal thing, what would be an example of that?
Well, there's a lot of ways that can happen. Person has a dream, and then all of a sudden the dream shows up in life, and they get that kind of weird deja vu, like a little bit of the eerie, not necessarily bad or anything, but just like, whoa, like any kinds of experiences that people we're in one of these moments where they start to see beyond the normal veils, and there's a feeling of something much greater going on. Soul work often has a lot of connection to ancestors, to land, to time and space that becomes a lot more fluid and multidimensional. So people might have a spontaneous kind of altered state of consciousness and kind of get a sense. You talked about the Pixies earlier, but like
not the band, but
like the elemental beings or whatever. But any kinds of experiences where people have a sense of like that life, this world is actually alive and conscious. And the dead are not dead, they're actually still living with us in some way or another. You can take that metaphorically, you could take that more literally perhaps. And land, like we talked about the church, right? The land and the building actually holds the memory of all of those experiences over that period of time. And that can be, again, benevolent, it can be complicated or confused. We can see trajectories or energies play throughout a family through multiple generations. In the old like novels, it's like the family's cursed. That's not really how you want to think of it, but like a different way of saying that is we can actually see intergenerational trauma playing it out, and it has this weird quality where like all of a sudden the person is kind of living someone else's story, and hopefully maybe they catch that, and then they can break the link and then move forward into their own life so that they're not playing out some unlived life of some great grandfather or some family secret that's haunting the family. And it's like some Wuthering Heights or something, like the building and the fall, the House of Usher, and like the building holds the family secret,
Yeah, definitely.
So there's all kinds of ways. Those would be examples. If someone gets into meditation practice, or if they get into really deep somatic work, it's very possible to open up another can of worms, essentially. There's a lot of popularity right now with like plant medicine, for example. That would be another route that a lot of people will sometimes take to bring forward an altered state. And that can have its pluses and minuses if they're ready for it or not ready for it. But any experiences that give us just even a glimpse where we think that we live in this kind of just purely linear cause and effect world. And then for a moment that's temporarily overridden, and there's some sense of like, oh man, there's some whole other mysterious, wild
thing
going on. And I'm in it somehow or other.
For sure.
That's generally how it starts for people. And it can be really beautiful things too. Person goes up on a nice hike, gets to the top of a beautiful vista, and all of a sudden your sense of like separation,
it's gone.
Your normal sense of suffering and just gone for a second. And it's just like bliss and luminosity.
It's true.
That's lovely. The difference in soul work is at some point, I mean, my life is people just telling me stories of all this kind of stuff. Like my grandmother came to me in my dream and told me, how it was going to be, and messages I had to give to my family. And then I found out the next morning she had passed, or, whatever. These are like, I hear these, like, it usually takes a beer or two for most, a glass of wine or so, then they'll the stories will come out. But soul work is when those experiences we stop seeing them as just these kind of random one-offs that I only talk about when I've had a couple whatevers, and then I'm like, oh, by the way, I had this weird thing happen to me, and it just kind of is off in this weird corner.
It's its own like room. It has separated. Yeah,
it's just cordoned off somewhere, and it's like, whatever, that was weird, or I made it up, or the person tries to convince themselves back to regular life.
Yeah.
Soul work really starts, the soul path really starts when the person stops treating it as these random one-offs and starts to say, there's something actually trying to communicate. And who or what is that? And what is it trying to say? And how do I listen? And should I trust it or not? And how do I know it's real or not? Like, that's when the questions become really existential and genuine and valid. And now it's really starting to happen.
It's interesting. True story. Just before we hopped on an hour or so ago, I ran down to where my clothes are in the house, and I put on this shirt. And I rarely wear this shirt, and the physicality of me going down the stairs, knowing where I was going, I had a huge whiff of deja vu.
Right.
And it was like, oh yeah, this is happening. This is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
And it's, I always say to my students that, when you're working with your emotions and sensations and the question, the $1 million question, how do I release my traumas? How do I get them out? I'm like, well, you can't. You got to wait for them to arise through the sensation or through the image or through the dream or the weird thought that you've never thought before.
Totally.
Or the desire to eat sardines and you never had. Like, that happened to me the other day. I've never craved sardines. I'm like, what the heck is going on here?
Right.
But you have to go with it, because those hints are offering, I believe, that branch, that connection to that other dimension.
Yeah.
Isn't like solid, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's that's why I put a lot of emphasis on interpretation, or another word for which would be discernment. So to me, the connection to, call it that other world, and this world, but it's not really other, but it interpenetrates.
Yeah.
This world, there's a lot of ways one can go with that. So to me, it's an important emphasis to put it on practicality and being clear and having a strong agency and clarity and having it have practical, actionable value for this life, rather than let's spend 20 years, checking out all my so-called past lives or whatever, like just for an informational trip or whatever, like a spiritual junkiism. Like that's not a good idea. I think it's like there is something, we are living in communion, I would say. If I'm going to use some Catholic language, we are living in communion or a sacramental relationship with other forces and realities. And I think it's really important that we actually do that in a way that's harmonious, conscious. Because if not, the experience and the wisdom in those teachings has always been like, it won't go so well. And not as a punishment model, not this like, tisk, 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 you're going to go to hell. It's more like a choose ways of being that enhance everyone's well-being, you and your relations. Or if you choose not, then there are going to be things are going to spin out. And we just know that from trauma. And when the center doesn't hold and things fall apart, it's the saying as the poem has it. And we're in one of those moments where, we were talking and you said containment. Things can really, like a lot of the reasons I think that the religious thing is going by the wayside in a lot of ways is the form of those systems doesn't necessarily catch up to the speed of the world we're living in. Even though I think there's a lot of nuggets or pearls of timeless value and beauty there, and others are trying to kind of rescue those as the ship is kind of going down, basically. Get the good stuff off the treasure. But the systems of the world, whether they're religious or we're seeing political or media or pick your favorite, financial, they're not cohesive, they're not adaptive, they're not evolved to meet the demands of the present moment. And so the situation's overrunning them. And these systems are in chaos. And some are getting rigid and violent or militarized, perhaps. And others are just fracturing and splintering. And that could be a first step. As you know, in working with people, when their kind of like repression or their coping strategies aren't working, it gets more tumultuous. But on the one hand, it's now got the possibility of like, oh, this coping mechanism wasn't actually coping. It's kind of eating me alive. On the other hand, when the coping mechanism starts dissolving, if a new form of generative presence and agency and competency isn't coming in, then things can break down instead of break through. And we're seeing a lot of chaos and fracture that's occurring because the systems clearly are not working anymore. And people are worried that the only options are the existing system or the flood. Like it's really like, or it's just going to be pure chaos and nihilism, and it's just going to all completely spin out into total catastrophe. And to really point out, like, from the wisdom of these traditions, there is a third option. There is a possibility of a way here. And here I would say there is a way. It's not a religious way. It's not I'm going to tell you the doctrines you need to believe in this way. It's not that. But there is a path that is the path of neither holding into this problematic system at all costs, even if it comes at your own sacrifice, or we're just going to be in total chaos and everything's just going to go to hell.
Gonna blow up.
But actually, no, like we can actually adapt. We can actually mature. We can actually embody something that is fundamentally right. and aligned. And this death in religious language could become a step towards a resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not, to me, it's a very open system.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, it's not at all, this is my own theology speaking, so people can agree or disagree, but
yeah.
I don't have a view that it's all predestined. I think it's actually wide open. So,
mm-hmm. It could go any way.
It's a little bit of depending on how we choose to deal with it.
Exactly. It's interesting because you see, some people will say it is written, others will say it hasn't been written. It's a fascinating thing because I think some people know when they are here on this earth planet what they're supposed to do, and if they follow those impulses and really are true to their soul, their gut, their heart, their circumstance, and they follow that, it almost feels like it's written. Doesn't mean there isn't hardship and stress and challenge, but your ability to move through that is a little easier.
Yeah.
You're not questioning as much. But then if we look at the collective and the bigger picture, every person is contributing to that forward movement as the collective, and then that's where it gets dicey.
Right.
As you said to me the other day in an email, it's a spicy meatball, right? It's like,
that's very...
like, this is a spicy meatball we're dealing with because everyone's at a different level, because humans aren't like baby animals in the wild. We're all raised differently, culture is different, teachings are different, how we eat is different, how we pray is different. And so we've got all this diversity, which is great, but it's also posing that universal spirit wants a certain thing, you know, as you said, there's a third way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I do really believe deep down that the soul of each person is their own, if you like, guru or their own teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for collective change, we really need sovereign beings who are willing to kind of put their chip in and then say, from their fullness, from a sense of their own empowerment, like, all right, what can we all do together now? And I think the possibility, so I'm, I sometimes get teased and I'm very pessimistic, but I actually think that I'm actually extremely hopeful because I see as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an optimist. I would say I'm not an optimist. And for me, optimism is like, it's just going to get better because...
I think we're in the same boat there too.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of hope, and I also am like,
Yeah.
I
think the present moment should really dispel any kind of notion of some nice, easy, gradual, optimistic, a rising tide will lift all boats. No. It'll sink some of them, just to be clear.
Yeah.
So, the hope to me is always the possibility that we could actually align to these aspects of grace. Mm-hmm. And I've seen, and you've seen, I'm okay to use the word a miracle.
Yeah.
Not like, it's not like I'm like this and I put my hand on somebody and they walk out of the wheelchair and they're like, hallelujah, the money goes flying. It's not that, but like I've seen, again, that, like, to me, what a real miracle, like I've seen people transform through just absolutely horrendous amounts of things and become beings of just incredible light.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a miracle.
It is a miracle.
And that miracle, I think, is totally available even there's always opportunity. Soul work to me is always like, the folks I look to are ones who are really, Jesus has a line in the Gospels I always think is interesting, which is to be as innocent as a dove and as crafty as a serpent. It's one of my favorite Jesus sayings.
Say that one more time, slower.
Innocent Innocent as a dove, crafty, or I might say shrewd, as a serpent or a snake. So I don't think it should be, I think people in this world who are trying to do whatever we call this, kind of embodying or anchoring or transmitting light, normally that gets placed in the new agey thing as this kind of like pretty pastel-y, it's all this, lovey-dovey, and it just feels so feeble, right? It feels so like there's no guts to that. There's no
100%.
But, innocent as a dove, crafty as a serpent. That's got some.
That's a bang there. Bang for that one.
So, we got to be street smart. We got to be adaptable. Got to be light on our feet in the midst of very fluid situations, while still, I think, trying to hold a real, just really anchor in clarity and peace. So that even that is enough to transmit like the chaos of the present moment, all the stuff in whirl and spinning. There is actually a way that we can be with each other that doesn't require all this madness.
And the rigidity and the chaos.
Or the helplessness.
Or the helplessness. Yeah. Let's talk about that, because again, my notes here, this was a yes. And the intersection, you said, of trauma work and spiritual practice. And then these terms because we've worked together, but it's the principles of resourcing, pendulation, orienting, titration. I'm not going to define these right now. I'll post some videos that actually describe every single one of those. But this resourcing, pendulation, orientation, and titration to spiritual practice and experience itself. So the importance of those elements of really good trauma, somatic trauma work, and how that obviously guides and aids spiritual soul practice versus, you said, and conversely, how spiritual practice done unregulated and non-titrated can be itself traumatic.
Right. So for example, to give an example, don't do like me in my 20s and meditate for 10 hours a day. That's not titrated.
You do that, Chris, really?
For a period of my life, yeah. I don't recommend it.
I don't.
Don't do as I say, or as I did. So I mean that's extreme, but in pared down versions, this is again the problem of kind of like whatever, the one system is the one system to rule them all. My meditation practice will heal all my ails, right? That was our last discussion. Or sub out meditation and put something else in there, right?
Yoga. Green juice.
Precisely.
Sorry,
ayahuasca. Ayahuasca.
I love my green juice.
That's a different kind of green juice.
Yeah.
A little more potent.
Yeah.
But you can slot anything in there, becomes the answer for everything. And it's just not, we have to be able to, if we're going to connect these other aspects of ourselves, which are potent, can be a bit esoteric, are subtle, but nevertheless can be extremely powerful. We also need to remember, as long as we're having this conversation in human form here in earthly reality, it needs to be able to work in a way that's like like a vessel, right? Like the sacramental cup from Catholicism, right? Like
solid.
The filter system has to be able to handle the energy and bring it through in a way that is cohesive and coherent and doesn't fry somebody's circuits.
Which can happen and does happen.
People have Kundalini type experiences and they get totally overwhelmed and it fries them. And it's not fun to have to help rebuild and deal with burnt circuitry, frankly.
No, it's like trying to put a scrambled egg back to the pure form. I mean, that's an extreme example, because it is possible to heal from severe fracturing and it's not just the psyche, it's the physiology, as you know. And so if someone doesn't have, if we go back to that titrated,
right,
regulated, resourced, connected, it can be highly damaging. And true story, apparently, your example about meditating for 10 days, because Vipassana has become these 10-day
right,
retreats. I mean, I looked a few years ago, you couldn't find one. They were all booked
right,
up. But it's Spirit Rock, and again, this is urban myth, but I'm pretty sure it's true. I heard this through colleagues that used to work there. They now require, or they used to require, all the teachers to have at least the first year of somatic experiencing training, because they were having to take people away in ambulances.
yeah,
And that's that's because they're having not just a nervous mental breakdown, their heart, their respiratory patterns, their gut is going crazy, because all of this opening can't be contained with the little amount of capacity that they have.
right.
And apparently now again, this was what I heard a few years ago.
Right.
When there is a retreat, there is an ambulance like on site waiting. I'm like, why? Is
Right.
that
So
really...
like, that's the classic, like, oh, how do we deal with the symptom, or versus like, oh, maybe this should be wait a minute, maybe we need to rethink some foundational aspects here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in our last conversation, we talked a lot about how many of those practices were developed in monastic settings.
Yes, thank you.
Where, it's very serene, and people aren't necessarily doing, on their phones and having to deal with mortgages, and the kids are screaming and all that stuff. And so it's not to say that those forms of medicine aren't potent, but they weren't designed thinking of the contemporary person with that in mind. So they need to be rethought, at least in some very important ways, in terms of how they're going to be translated.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think to this question about how can these important practices of titration and pendulation and resourcing, back to a point about sovereignty, rather than giving our agency or our power away to a religious system or a whatever system, being able to ground, to resource oneself, to regulate one's own experience is worth more than the weight of gold. I mean, expecting any kind of system around of whatever variety to know how to do that for you is not an assumption one should be making.
No, it's risky business.
And we see that whether it's in the people doing extreme fasting, extreme this, whatever, right? Like that on whatever front, like the ability to regulate one's own experience is absolutely foundational.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, learn how to do that before, I want to learn how to say 10,000 mantras and, meditate to the star. You're like, astral travel to the stars. Like, no. You need to learn how to be on this planet first before you want to go to Jupiter or wherever. like way more important to be here in a coherent fashion. And then we want to open up to some of the wider, more transcendental aspects of being. Again, that's cool, so long as then it's routed and embedded through a very, otherwise it just becomes either spiritual bypassing, or people go new agey floaty and they're just off in the whereversville, and it's like, I have no idea where you are, just on, cloud 9 or whatever. I don't see that helpful.
No, this idea of being able to integrate to the here and now, but still practice these practices, these concepts, these ideas. But at the end of the day, at least so far, maybe when we talk in 3 years, we're going to have something that we didn't
Right.
conceive of being here, but we still have to live here in the three-dimensional world. I wanted to ask, what is the root of the word sovereign? Because you've mentioned it a few times. It's not something I have in my vocabulary. I mean, I hear it. What does it actually mean?
Great question. Thanks for. To me, it means, again, like that the soul of each person is its own teacher. The king or the queen or the ruler of their castle.
Got it.
Again, rather than so, and this, again, you can see why, in part, you might be noticing why I'm speaking formerly as a priest and currently as the guy that I am, right? You can see some of the transition that's occurred over time, but to really be, again, not in an egoic way. And this is the subtle differentiation in this work, right? Like a lot of people can just, oh, I'm in charge of me and I'm, and I don't mean that kind of rugged individualism thing. I've had enough of that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, like, if you ever see some people who just, like, they're them and they kind of have, we call it an aura, you say radiate, whatever, but they got like a field around them.
Yeah.
And you're just like, wow, that's like
solid.
That's them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean they're pushy. Usually quite they're not, actually. But they're just like doing their thing and it's coming across. To
like
me,
it's like a sense of agency, life force energy. We could even see there's regulation within that, right?
They're captain of their ship.
Yeah.
To me, and that's important. Rather than, determined by some kind of scripting, family scripting or whatever, general social conditioning, or just being against all of that, like the classic kind of rebel without a cause archetype, right? Like I'm just, I'm against this and I'm against that. It's like, well, what do you stand for, right? Like, that's great. I'm against a lot of those things too, but like, what's the opposite? What's the positive?
Yeah.
So people who can really hold their own energy and really kind of transmit, it's both a kind of elegance, but also kindness, but also power, is to me really important.
Multidimensional and very integrative too. And I think that goes back to our discussions a second ago about doing the work on the physical nervous system level, because there's often this all or none, like, oh, I'm always, this is how I perceive I have to be, but then when I'm here I'm this, but then when I'm there I'm that. And we know that occurs due to a person usually having to create safety boundaries growing up, which leads me to a question I wanted to ask. And then we'll head back to just your work and how to start that soul work. But I'm hearing more and more people. I even have a good friend who's she calls herself ex-Mormon. She's healing from a lot of bad stuff and a lot of shame, a lot of guilt from leaving that community. But we would call it religious trauma. I would call it religious abuse, because trauma is dependent on how it sits in a person's system. But how would you speak to someone who's listening to this and they have a hunch that maybe what they were put through it's usually as a child. Typically, I mean, people find religion as adults, of course, but for the sake of simplicity, those that went through a certain type of dogma and religion, and they know, or maybe they haven't thought about it, but it's like, yeah, maybe there's something that got wired into me that's causing me to not trust working with the spirit and the soul. So what would you say around that? I'm sure you've worked with people in your practice that have been abused by the church and by those ideals.
Yeah, it's
big one.
mhm. I mean, any of these things always involve human beings that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Might also involve other beings as well, at least some kind of connections. That's cool too. But
Yeah.
let's keep it to the human front.
Mm-hmm.
And we humans are quite, what's the word I want? We're quite susceptible.
Mm.
You know, we're some more than others,
Yeah.
but we're all fallible,
Mm-hmm.
or at least potentially so.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, again, not to write off that institutions don't cultivate energies that are anti-life, because they do, consciously, or in rare cases, or more often unconsciously, I would say.
Say that one more time, because what you said was really important there about institutions.
Yeah, groups, just like buildings, like you talked about, the church can have that actual church building can have like the accumulated energy over time, and it, in that sense, with a healthy version. Groups and institutions over time have kind of like their own soul, or soul-like quality. They have their own energy, and they have their own, if you like, karma or momentum.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who went through some of the particular challenges around that can happen a lot in Mormon communities, it has a specific lineage. But then again, there's like how many books of people leaving, right, that would have the same, they would know that. Or for me, the Catholic thing with shame around certain stuff. So groups then can take on these energies. They can take on, if the teaching leads to that humans are sinful, or humans are craven, and we're only focused on the potential vulnerabilities or dark sides, we might call it, then people start to get a very unhealthy view of human nature, a very distorted lens. And that can lead to a lot of this kind of like, humans are evil, we're all sinful. Or alternatively, you can do a new agey thing. We're all just perfect, and we're all just trying our best, and we're all just on our journeys, and we're all just learning. What are you talking about? Right?
Yeah,
No, there's actual like really awful stuff. So
I love
really,
I love how your voice changes with that. It's just perfect.
So yeah, it's like immediately like, oh, it's just icky. Mm-hmm. So I think to be able to really have a solid view of who we are. So to me, it's always important to say like who I think we are as human beings prior to, or not, at least not dependent on all this other outside stuff that we don't necessarily have a choice around. So yes, a person may have gone through a system that harmed them. Does that mean, are they going to allow that harm, that poison, to continue to poison them by believing the story that they were told in that, which is that they're some kind of awful being and they deserve to be punished? Or are they going to find a deeper resource and a deeper beauty and a deeper wholeness in their being, that actually, goodness and benevolence, that actually, like, that's not true?
Yeah.
And that, to be able to locate that aspect, that becomes the antidote. All of a sudden, it's like, actually, there's all this gunk or poison that was put onto me. I'm going to now expel it because it's false, because it's ultimately not true. Who we're all in our essence, I believe, really deeply, fundamentally, is we're made in goodness. Now, that essence can get obscured. Certainly, it can get covered over or covered in mud or whatever. But for me, nothing can come and eventually, again, it might cover over, or we might lose our connection to it, or make it more difficult or obstruct or interfere. Like, all that happens. But there is, to me, like a core pristine wholeness that's never broken, and we can always come back to that place and then grow from there.
Find it. So that then, you mentioned a little while ago that the soul, because I was reading a book a little while ago about souls and past life work, and the doctor, Brian Weiss, and I love his work, but he said something that I felt was inaccurate. And then I confirmed that with Seth, so I'm going to confirm it with you. But he said the soul can never be traumatized or never be harmed. And you mentioned a little while ago that it can fragment and become, so people say, oh, she's a lost soul, he's a lost soul.
Right.
And so whether it's religious abuse or parental abuse or bullying at school or being stuck in an incubator and being poked and prodded before we have the cognitive ability to understand that, the system is in some way not safe. Let me make it real simple. Not safe. The world is dangerous. I can't be who I am because this has been done to me, so I must not be good, because why would this occur to me?
Then the soul's like,
leaves.
I'm out.
Peace out.
I'm gonna go to the Bahamas or wherever. I'm out. I'm gonna go hang out in the subtle plains for a while.
And so could you say then that someone's soul may, I guess it goes back to our thing about soul retrieval, that it literally has left the building?
That's extreme case.
Okay.
But certainly, I'll see lots of where certainly pieces are fragmented, or I would say like the tether is really stretched, let's say, or is very thin. And to the degree that our soul essence, what personal essence, if you like that word better, it's kind of left the building, to whatever degree that can occur, or is abdicated, then nature abhors a vacuum. Something will want to fill that space,
right,
that would otherwise want to be occupied by our own soul. And generally that might be family scripting, that can be religious scripting or implantation, that can be a person in adulthood who ends up in a very problematic or entangled relationship where the other person is manipulating or using them. It can be exploitation.
Brought into bad circles, gangs, addictions.
There's all kinds of scenarios that want to fill that void. And they generally have an agenda to, like a computer virus or something. They want to take up some space and start to implant their own programming. And it might even be well-intentioned. Hell, it might even be officially like trying to be. But to me, again, like the really important emphasis on sovereignty as a primary principle is that we really want to see not that kind of distortion, and really say like, who belongs in the seat for each person, to me, is their soul. And to bring that back, and then that really does bring forward a different process where a person is trying to get their deepest, truest self, I guess we might say, really at the core of their being, and having the rest of ourselves trying to line back up and be reintegrated according to our essence. And if we spent a long time with some other aspect kind of running the show, like the captain leaves the ship, the first mate takes over, and the first mate isn't prepared to be the captain.
Doesn't know how to do it yet.
Tries his or her best, but is going to make a mess of things. then the spiritual thing can come in as like, oh, the ego is terrible. Let's kill the ego. Let's annihilate it. And I'm like, well, actually, it's just doing the job that it's not actually designed for. And so it might actually be trying its best, but it's set up for failure. I don't think we need to beat it up or murder it or annihilate it here. We need to get the one that rightly belongs in the seat and get things starting to be reorganized according to, I think, a deeper intelligence. Yeah.
I love that. It's sort of like when people come to do the work through the nervous system lens with myself and my colleagues, and they'll have coping strategies, practices. Heck, they might be really harmful and not helpful.
Right.
But, you can't say to someone, stop all of that, because then they're left with nothing to keep them somewhat sane and at least somewhat self-regulated, even though it's not good regulation. You can't say to a child who's going into shutdown when all they're around is abuse, stop shutting down. It's built into the unconscious system to shut down, to protect.
Right.
But this ability to say, okay, that ego has been driving, and that's okay. That was adaptive for the current time, and now we're going to slowly guide this other piece in, I think is a more sane way of looking at it. It kind of goes back to that whole go to that retreat and just sit for 10 hours for 10 days. And, it's like,
yeah,
it's interesting. And anyway, I think that's a very interesting way of putting it. And of course, I understand that and how it works. Did you have a follow-up to that? Because I wanted to ask you the next step to that, but anything?
No, go ahead and ask that.
No, so let's just say, someone wants to start this process of guiding their soul back because maybe they realized it did peace out a while ago.
Or aspects,
parts of it. And I know, our work again is so complex, integrated. It's impossible to say, well, we would start here, here.
Sure.
But what's an overarching way that you would talk about the work that you currently do now, given all of the experiences and pieces you've gathered? How do you start with someone?
Well, first thing is really to discern. To me, it's really important. Is the soul knocking at the door? At least in the way that I feel that I'm most of assistance.
Yeah.
And if not yet, then it's more, there's other things to be doing. So, this process or soul work to me is really a lot about right timing. So typically people will have some kind of experience of saying like, there's this other thing, I've done all this work, but there's this thing and I can feel it, but I can't name it. And I don't really know what it is, but that to me is kind of the typical language. That's probably you're hitting the soul bell, maybe. I know that's a bit vaguey, but it actually, for people for whom it's not vague, it's like, oh, yeah. It actually does resonate.
That's my soul knocking, okay.
And sometimes it's a little bit of a lighter, tap, and sometimes it's a real bang, and sometimes the door has already been kicked down. That's not generally the recommended path, but it does happen. So if there is some kind of a knocking, it's really about opening the door. There's someone or something on the other side of that door, which is both very familiar and might seem pretty foreign at the same time.
Right.
And over time, I would say, and it's not just me who says this, I think this is a thing that has been said, and I agree with it. Eventually, at first, it seems like we're opening the door. But over time, it's more like that one does the work.
How do you mean?
Eventually, like if the soul kind of sitting more in what I'm calling the captain's chair or the throne.
Yep.
We say it, but really it is not an it, it's you.
Yeah.
It's me, it's
all of it.
Yeah. That's the one that does the work.
Mm-hmm.
At first, most times people will feel more like this kind of thing, like whether they name it like their ego and their soul or their higher self or whatever. And they'll do things like, I want to like I go into a meditative state and like write down questions in my soul and I get answers. And it's like, it's a higher self, or it's my inner light, or it's my deeper self. It's always somewhere like close by, but not the central identity. It's like, I'm me, and then there's this other thing and I chit chat with it.
Right.
That's usually the first stage.
Got it.
But eventually the idea is it's not a higher self, it's actually the self. And so I always say to people, it's not you're a person with a soul. Eventually it ought to flip to you're a soul that has a personality.
Yeah.
And who's the subject and kind of switches. And that's, that's when it's really kind of like, for me, again, really to emphasize, like each person really does have their own destiny.
Yeah.
And it really is encoded in that part of themselves. And my work with people that I always emphasize is interpretation or translation, because I'm not the guru.
No.
So I do my best to try to translate and act like a translator at the beginning between what I would consider to be the soul of that individual and their normal sense of themselves, let's say. And it does seem a little bit me like translating back and forth.
Got it.
But really, in the long haul, my interest is actually to be what I say often more like an ESL teacher.
English is a second language.
Right, in the sense that, except it's not English is the second language here. It's the soul has its own grammar and idiom and syntax and language that is unique to each person. So ultimately, they need to learn how to translate the language of their own soul for themselves, become fluent in their own native language. And so I'm more like trying to teach them how to understand their own language.
I love that.
So that, again, from an empowerment point of view, it's not like, I go to my person who tells me what I'm supposed to, no.
You don't like that, Chris? Just get psychic readings all and not do anything.
No, like,
I
like, we can always have assistance. We can always have connection. I'm always up for guidance and hearing other, but again, it's like, we always have to come back to check, like, does it resonate?
Yeah.
For me, and how do I make sense of this? Because at the end of the day, we're the interpreters of our own experience. So.
No, I like that. That's good. And to not knock psychic readings, because it's something to dabble with, or a nice tarot card or a nice astrology.
If you approach it if a person approaches it and any reader will tell you, any good reader will know right away, the person who's coming in like, hey, can you give me some, and then they really take it in and they take it on themselves versus, oh, please, they want to abdicate their responsibility. They want to abdicate their empowerment, say, hey, just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Because I don't want to have to work through my own discernment and clarity for myself.
100%. No, that's a really good distinction. It kind of goes back to that image I painted of the guy in the ditch, and I think we do need guidance. We need helpers, and we need to be drawn to the helpers. But who wants to be at age 80 or 50 or wherever, constantly not knowing how to follow your own purpose and listen to these things? And I do think that because we have had so much abuse, adversity, stress,
our programs have been so strong. We've been plugged into this matrix, if you want to call it that, for so long, that we do really need help. I do think there's a reason why you do your work, I do my work, our colleagues do their work, but how to use their work in an intelligent way so that we're not like vampires sucking the life out of someone so that we can keep living. That's a gruesome example, but you know, we want to create our own energy as opposed to having to constantly feed off of others to keep going.
Yeah, or to need some system.
Yes.
That's out here, and it's like I have come up to a decision. Okay, what does my system tell me? Oh, I better check to do my calculations. Okay, here we go. No, but it's like, no, it's the compass or the GPS or whatever really needs to be internal so that it becomes more fluid and adaptive. Like, oh, what is? Well, let me. Yeah, that would work better.
Yeah, that's great. I think we've covered a lot, my dear. So, we have. How did that? The time. So everything that we've talked about, any resource links will be below this video, or wherever people are listening, will be somewhere near the video or the audio. Who knows? Might go podcast style. If someone would want to work with you, how are you offering your work these days?
Good question.
Yeah. Knowing that it evolves. I know that too, right?
Yeah, and it's actually in the current moment. It's actually in some new stuff is coming on board, so it's a good time. So the primary way that I've worked, and I will still be working in this way, has been one-on-one, and usually in quite a container and over a period. Depends on the person, but usually like 6 months to 9 months kind of thing. Where we do readings about the nature of their soul and strengths and areas of challenge, and focus on the areas of challenge and build resource. What's their work? What's not their work? And that's wonderful. And then also I will be starting to teach. So I work in a specific energy system or modality that's not super well known. That is called Crystalline Consciousness Technique, or CCT for short.
Okay.
And it's largely been I've largely been working with people one-on-one, and I use that to create the energetic container in which the work happens, but I haven't really been talking about it except in rare cases where people ask.
Sure.
But the teaching element will be now to actually back to this kind of like ESL teacher thing.
Yeah.
To translate the tools very specifically to work in the same sort of system lineage that I work in. Which is nice because, again, there is a system. Back to this question of religion. It's not a religion because it doesn't have a bunch of doctrines or whatever, but there is a modality, there is structure, there is coherence, but I find it to be very life-giving and very creative. Like the lines on a basketball or a soccer field, and some basic principles that allow for the expression of, art, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that is really exciting. I'm really excited for that because this, it all takes place within a specific field, which I've been trying to kind of point towards, but haven't really explicitly named yet. But it's just a field of real stillness. And equanimity. And we all need some of that. And it's a field that's clear. And for me, that's the starting point, not the ending point. So a lot of the systems, or the older systems to me, are built like you do all this work to get to that place. That's the destination.
Yeah.
But I think at this point, it's the reverse. I actually think that that's the ground and the foundation for which then we actually turn towards start with wholeness. I always tell folks I'm working with, we start with wholeness, and then we turn to the brokenness from the wholeness. Versus start with the brokenness, and until I get whole, I'm broken.
Yeah.
Or, I've got the wholeness, spiritual bypass. Yeah, everything's great. I'm going to go on my pod and fly off into the cosmos. No, it's like the wholeness now is actually the thing to which we need to turn towards, whether it's on an individual level, whether it's in families and relations, groups. You can take it at whatever level you want. Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
I like it.
So.
Cool.
And those can be taught this way.
Yeah, through Zoom.
Yeah.
The Zoom, the Skype, the
whatevers. Yeah.
The whatevers. Anything else, like if you had a parting word or sentence or communication to those listening who've, hung out for the whole hour and almost 2 hours that we've been talking, what would it be? What's on your mind these days?
Well, yeah. There's a lot of storms about. And in your classic hurricane type scenario, there's an eye of the storm. There is this calm, still place. And again, that's not the escape hatch. But to me, that is the only place from which we can actually start to find clarity and figure out a way where we're actually going to come together with each other and go forward in a way that's actually just and life-giving and caring. And otherwise, again, chaos can just feed on itself and take on its own life, unfortunately.
I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
You are so welcome.
It's great as always.